Hi, I'm Dr. Shiloh.
And I'm Dr. Scott.
And this is LA Not So Confidential, the forensic psychology and true crime podcast.
Each week, we explore the intersection of psychology, the criminal justice system, and entertainment.
Today, our episode is on the forensic psych topic of Police Explorer Program abuse. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to LA Not So Confidential. Dr. Scott, how are you doing today?
Great. It's our 3-day weekend, so enjoying it.
It is.
Just zoomed through like an entire day of errands and stuff yesterday, knocking this out early. I still have like a full 24 hours.
Yeah. Do you have Monday off?
Relax.
You have Monday off, right?
I have Monday off, but I have private clients at night. So
Yes.
there we go.
Got it.
How are you?
Got it. I'm good. I have about 15 days until I take off for Europe. So we'll see you there. But yeah, I feel like it's like gotta get all my clothes pulled, start getting my checklists ready. You know how I am. I feel actually a little behind 2 weeks out, but I'll get there. We cannot wait to be there. Dr. Scott and I were just reviewing our presentation for you guys at CrimeCon UK, and we are tightening up a couple things, but it's going to be great. We learned from last year, we will leave plenty of time for questions afterwards.
Definitely.
So make sure you guys please come to our presentation and please stop by the booth both Saturday and Sunday. We'll have some special swag. We always make a special limited edition sticker for every event we go to. And you guys, these are adorable. Love them. Can't wait for you to see
great.
them. I do have like one little piece of housekeeping right off the top. We have had a couple of reviews in which people have complained about the ads in earlier episodes being in really awkward places, you know, mid-sentence, kind of jarring out of nowhere. We totally get it. We totally understand. There is a reason for that. And back in May, we completely switched platforms when we went back to our old schedule, essentially. And with that means that all of sort of the ad placement that we had done before is now sort of being done by AI and being generated in places where they think there is a pause and where it makes sense. But Dr. Scott and I, when we have the time, are having to go back to, 175 plus episodes and listen and do that manually. So we get it. Super annoying. We're working on it is all I can say. And I'm probably preaching to the choir at this point because those are probably folks that are going back to the beginning and listening. And maybe they're not even listening to this little PSA that I have. But it's just one of those things. I mean, we got to find time to do it. And it is what it is.
Thank you for bringing that up. We've gotten several comments about it, and we will do what we can here with this new platform, which is actually even better than where we were before. It's just use of ease is great, but, we were not preparing in our earlier years to have ad space, really. So anyway, let me recap our last episode. We brought you a vintage case and journeyed virtually to our favorite place in Southern California, Palm Springs. We give you a little history on this desert getaway and share the tumultuous life of Tom Neal, a promising Hollywood actor in the late 1930s. He was groomed to be the next Clark Gable. However, his career was overshadowed by scandalous affairs and headline-grabbing incidents that eventually derailed his success. And despite several attempts to reinvent himself over the years, his desperation and addiction led to business failures, scandal, and a brutal murder. So for our show upcoming, this little trigger warning, doing this a little earlier before we even get into the meat of it, we are going to cover a disturbing story right off the bat. So trigger warning for themes of sexual abuse of minors, police abuse of power, murder, and suicide, and frustration likely about the light sentences that were doled out for these terrible crimes.
Yeah, at least so far. We'll see what changes in the future. But yes, frustration is an underlying feeling for sure at the bare minimum. I was just ranting to Scott about getting riled up about this last night again and how angry I am for the folks in this episode. But it will also make sense, as we talk about this, why this hits so close to home. So This topic really came to us after discussing this case on a Patreon episode. It was one of our Patreon only shrink wrap episodes back in July. And we were just kind of talking about the Karen Read case being wrapped up and the trial being wrapped up. And this one came onto our radar afterwards because some of the same police agencies were involved. So that's the case of Sandra Birchmore, which we're going to start off with today and give you a pretty good rundown because there's finally so much happening with it. And I think we all really need to stay tuned to us, but it lays the foundation for our topic today. So Sandra Birchmore was born in May 1997 in Stoughton, Massachusetts. She faced a challenging childhood. Her mother was very ill while Sandra was growing up. She had virtually no relationship with her birth father and then eventually lost her mother, grandmother, and stepfather at a relatively young age. These hardships led to ongoing mental and emotional struggles, prompting her to seek psychological care well into adulthood. And from a young age, Sandra deeply respected authority figures, especially police officers. So in March of 2010, Sandra applied to be a participant in the Police Explorers program at her local police department, Stoughton PD, and she was just 12 years old. She finally began participating in the program in or around the spring of 2010 when she had turned 13 and remained in the program until 2016, which would have been around age 19. The Stoughton PD had a robust Explorer program. In 2001, Robert Devine took over as the head of the program. And this is a man who was also the school resource officer in Stoughton and who eventually rose to the rank of deputy chief. So in most agencies, deputy chief is basically one or two below the actual chief of police. By 2011, the program had over 300 kids who had gone through the Explorer program. Devine had stated, quote, "It's more than actually training in law enforcement. Some kids find a home with the Explorers," end quote. No doubt this is something that Sandra gravitated towards at age 12 or 13, of course, without a father in her life and knowing that her mother would probably not be around much longer.
One of the drill instructors for the Explorer program was a former Explorer himself, and now Stoughton police officer named Matthew Farwell. So let me give you a little bit of background on Matthew. He had a twin brother named William Farwell, who was also a Stoughton police officer, and they had both been part of an elite explosives team in the military prior to returning home to the U.S. and joining SPD. Matt became an instructor for the Explorer program under Devine. And when he started working with the Stoughton Police Department in 2012, it was at this time he met Sandra, who was already a participant and 15 years old. Hold on to these ages as we go through this case study, because it's going to be really important later on. It's alleged that Matt started sexually exploiting Sandra in 2013 when she was still 15 years old. Farwell at that time was 27. Remember, the age of consent in Massachusetts is 16. Matt was also engaged to be married the month after his first exploitation of Sandra. I want to share a quote with you from the court documents. Building off the years of grooming, Farwell later cultivated a controlling and sometimes abusive relationship with Birchmore. He tracked her whereabouts with his cell phone, he engaged in sexual violence against Sandra, and he also engaged in sex acts with her while he was on duty. Sandra left the Explorers program in 2016. However, federal authorities have asserted that their sexual relationship continued until her untimely death. In October 2020, however, Sandra expressed to Matt that she had a desire to have a child, and that led to an agreement between them. Sandra would remain silent about Matt's sexual exploitation and keep their years-long extramarital affair secret in exchange for him agreeing to impregnate her, but he did not want his name on the birth certificate. And by December 2020, Sandra discovered she was pregnant and informed Matt that he was the father. In revealed text messages from January 2021, they suggest that Matt became furious when he discovered that Sandra had shared details, incriminating details, about their sexual relationship with several of her friends. Additionally, she expressed a desire to have his name on the birth certificate.
So by the time Sandra was pregnant, she was working as a teacher's aide for the Sharon Public School system and was taking classes in preparation for applying to nursing school. She was living in her own apartment in Canton, Massachusetts. That's the neighboring town to Stoughton, and was just excitedly preparing to be a mom. As a matter of fact, she had ordered and received a baby car seat within the hours leading up to the last moments that she was seen alive. On February 4th, 2021, her employer requested a welfare check for Sandra after she missed 3 days of work at the school. Around 11 a.m., Canton police officers arrived at her apartment. They knocked on the door, but nobody answered. A search of the parking lot noted that her car was parked in its normal parking spot with snow still on top of it, apparently undisturbed. The last time it snowed had been a few days earlier. So the police obtained the keys from the apartment management and entered the unit. They noted in their reports that the apartment was in some disarray and that there were 2 cats roaming around inside. The bedroom door was closed. When the officers entered Sandra's bedroom, the lights were off and she appeared to be seated on the floor with some sort of belt or rope secured tightly around her neck. The other end was secured to the handle of the bedroom closet door. It was quite obvious that Sandra had been dead for some time and no life-saving efforts needed to be done. Canton Fire Department arrived and officially pronounced her dead at approximately 11:45 a.m. Following her body being removed from the scene, the chief medical examiner ruled it a suicide, quote, asphyxia by hanging, end quote. And in a report conducted by Sergeant Michael Lenk, who was also on scene that day, he noted that the kitchen countertops in Sandra's apartment were covered with junk mail, some medication, and other debris, as well as a printout of an ultrasound with Sandra's name on it. All right, so with what we have so far, I think up until now, and, this is a few years old now, this happened in 2021, some people could assume that in Sandra's position, she could be quite emotionally fragile, maybe in a state with some of her history of some mental health struggles and a lot of pressure and heavy adulting things going on in her life, that perhaps she could be suicidal. And I know you and I have talked a gajillion times about how we try to say people were suicidal or were not suicidal, and how that never really seems to shake out in hindsight.
Yeah, it's problematic here too, because we've already set up enough of a backstory for listeners and for ourselves to know that this young woman was manipulated and gaslit and abused for a decade, right? I mean, this has already been going on. So regardless of where she started with her mental health issues, anyone would be challenged in this way. I mean, suicide could definitely be an issue. This is, she came from trauma even prior to entering the program. However, you never make assumptions, right?
Never.
That's what we hope that the forensics and the pathologists that are on scene are going to do a thorough investigation and look at all of these factors. I will say also that form of asphyxiation by doorknob means that you're not hanging from a closet rod, from a light fixture, from something high up. It is used, but it seems to me anecdotally that that's used in certain situations when you can't find a way to hang something higher. So already I would look at that if I was investigating. And of course, I'm not an investigator. I'm a psychologist, but I'd go, something seems off here.
So like we see it in prison cells, right? When people can't find something high up or, I get what you're saying.
But the plot does continue to thicken. You see, there is CCTV footage of the lobby of Sandra's apartment building from the evening that she was last heard from. So on the day of February 1st, she is seen entering and exiting her building a few times with her cell phone in her hand. I mean, this was a young woman who was constantly on her cell phone, and she's last seen in the early evening before retiring into her apartment for the night. At 9 p.m., she sends a text to a coworker asking about the school being open the next day since a snowstorm had moved in. Then at 9:14 p.m., a large-statured man wearing a hoodie up over his head and a COVID-type face mask enters the apartment lobby and then the elevators, and it was later identified as Matt Farwell. At 9:43 p.m., he's seen quickly exiting the lobby of the apartment building. Just 12 hours later, he's with his new wife at the hospital where they're welcoming their new baby boy. Matt is 35 years old at this point and is now a detective at Stoughton Police Department. No one ever hears from Sandra again. She was 3 months pregnant. And when Matt is asked why he went to Sandra's apartment that night, he said he was there to finally break it off with her and that they had a nasty argument, quote unquote, but that she was alive when he left.
Yeah. So now, I think people can also then start thinking, well, if they had a nasty argument, things didn't go the way she wanted, perhaps that could have been a motivator for suicide. Again, but these are all speculations, even some of the future planning, like we talk about her buying the car seat. We still know people who do that and then things change and then they do decide to take their lives. I will say the statistic, not just anecdotal information that I found, is that pregnant women are at very low risk to die by suicide, even if they've had some other struggles in the past.
And that's a stat.
Yeah.
So that's really important to point out. I will say anecdotally, and from a sense of like creating sort of, I am not a profiler. That is a specific training gift, right? But what I would say is that any adult individual with any type of insight into something that they have done which has been inappropriate and has a wife in the hospital giving birth to your child is not going to pick up and go physically to break something off with someone. That just doesn't make any sense
in the
whatsoever.
middle of a snowstorm.
In the middle of a snowstorm, that's not the priority. That's not reasonable. And the reason I say that, even just as an anecdotal sort of example, is that this is a guy who has now progressed to the rank of detective, right?
Sure.
So this is someone who has some skills, he has some ability, he has some intelligence. Anyone would know better than to do something like that.
Great point. Unless you're emotionally hijacked, right?
Exactly. Yes, that's just it.
Yeah.
That's a great little topper there for it.
So following Sandra's death, a closer look reveals an explosive, I almost hate saying this term, sex scandal at Stoughton
I know.
PD.
It sounds
right?
salacious, right?
It sounds salacious. It sounds like something going on in Hollywood, not with children. But let's lay this out. So Deputy Chief Robert Devine, who ran that Explorer program, we talked about him earlier. He finally resigned in 2022 after an internal affairs investigation showed he was also having a sexual relationship with Sandra and other girls and young women. You guys, if you want details about his behavior specifically, please go listen to the podcast, The Case, specifically season 2, which is where they cover Sandra's case, episode 2, for some very disturbing accounts of how Robert Devine acted with middle school girls while he was a school resource officer. There's unbelievable interviews from a young lady that will just make your stomach turn. And it's so detailed and so genuine and just jaw-dropping. But we're not going to get off on a tangent with him too much today. So this 19-month internal affairs investigation, which was in collaboration with the state police, which is a good thing, right? Another agency. However, this is also the state police that were responsible for the less than stellar investigation into the Karen Reed case. So take that for what you will. But they found that Matt Farwell was indeed the last person known to have seen Sandra alive, and that he admitted to going to her apartment to break up with her. They also uncovered at that time that he had had a sexual relationship with her since she was 15. So that's how that came out. And it was also revealed that not only did Matt and Robert Devine utilize Sandra for their sexual needs, but so did Matt's twin brother, William. So for lack of a better term, and I know this is crude, but this is exactly what they did. They completely passed Sandra around. All three resigned from the department about a month before the findings were revealed from this investigation. Resigned. Again, not fired. They resigned, and also resigned as in not hauled off to jail.
Wow.
So the investigation report by Massachusetts State Police states, quote, "The investigation did not yield sufficient probable cause with which to charge Matthew Farwell with a crime at that time," end quote. So following this bullshit result, Sandra's aunt, Darlene Smith, filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the Farwells, among other defendants, as responsible for Sandra's death due to a, quote, near decade-long scheme of grooming and repeated assault by members of the Stoughton Police Department, end quote. And then that's where things got kind of cold. That's where things were for a while, until people started talking about this case, of course, because of the alleged police corruption revealed live in court during the Karen Reed proceedings earlier this year. So, I mean, for the shit show that was, it's just so interesting to see where we are today in someone else's case, in Sandra's case. So in June of this year, Sandra's estate hired a forensic pathologist, Dr. Michael Baden, who wrote in his report that she was indeed a victim of strangulation and ruled her death a homicide. So that was done privately by the family. We know now that a forensic specialist commissioned by the FBI, who also recently started looking into this case, concurred. They ruled Sandra's death as a homicide due to the nature of the injuries. Federal investigators said they concluded Farwell staged her body after strangling her on February 1st, 2021.
And let's just take a moment here I know that we've talked about this a couple of times over our couple of hundred episodes now, but this would be a really good point to reiterate. Strangulation is a slow form of death. It is not shooting someone. It's not stabbing. It's not blunt force trauma. Strangling someone, generally the perpetrator is facing the victim and with their hands or an implement on the throat, pushing, and it takes several long minutes for the person to die. I just think that that's a very interesting thing to keep in mind here, that it was not a quick in and out. And then on top of it, after it's been concluded that it was a homicide, whoever perpetrated it then spent time making it look like a suicide.
Yes, and we know he was in her apartment for about a half an hour. So this past Wednesday, which would have been August 28th at the time we're recording, I get a text from my friend at the police department where I work, who has also been following all these cases with me, that Matt Farwell has been federally indicted. And of course, I jump online and I'm watching the press conference live. I actually watched it on our friend Bob Motta's channel. And it was so satisfying to hear that Boston had been sort of secretly investigating this in these last few months. And the tone of the press conference was perfect. You know, they kept Sandra front and center, even when it was time for a question and answer with the reporters. They were trying to get all these questions and kind of dipping into the salaciousness of it. And the federal prosecutor just kept bringing it back to Sandra and that a young woman was murdered and groomed from a very young age. And I loved how they handled that. He ended up being charged with one count, and that count is killing a witness or victim. I will put a link to the indictment in our show notes. It is a crime that carries potentially capital punishment. So killing a witness or victim, why do you think they went with that, Dr. Scott, rather than just like homicide?
Are they saying that at this time they don't have enough evidence to prove that it was him?
No. So because of this sex scandal being blown open, right, he could have still faced charges for having sex with her when she was a child. And who knows what else they found, because I'm sure there's way more. But essentially, she was the victim. She was also a witness to a lot of other potential crimes, and he took her out. So it's actually, in some sense, a meteor charge to put on him, because you can't just snuff out witnesses and victims to keep yourself from going to jail, which is exactly what they're alleging he did here.
So are they saying that they could go back and add on extra charges?
They could, or, you know, if the state was maybe simultaneously looking into some things that they wanted to charge all of these idiots with, you know, maybe that was still potentially happening.
Okay. Well, I think it goes without saying that this particular subject and case example, it just has so much to cover. There's not just one thing. It's like when we cover sex scandals in the church or abuse in these Scared Straight programs, there are just so many layers to tease apart.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, you know, this is incredibly disturbing for us. We cover all sorts of terrible things that terrible people do, but it's really hard to talk about, on one hand, just as a person, just in general, to talk about criminals who are part of society that we should innately trust, right? And we've done that, not unlike teachers, clergy, therapists, criminal counselors, all of those professions that we have covered before. But then there's the layer that you and I have too, where you've either been a part of it or you're attached to it by blood, by family, or by your work family. It really hits home in a different way. And, that's the place that you and I kind of sit in as we're talking about these things. And, I've also seen this from the inside out. I'll talk about this in just a little bit, but I was a police cadet, very much, being a young adult, wanting to enter the world of law enforcement, trying to figure out, who's somebody that is a mentor and taking interest in me for that reason, and who's the person that just wants to get in my pants. So, it hits different, and I'll expand on that in a moment. But just as we've done in other episodes, and I think probably most recently it was our extremism in the military episode, but we want to acknowledge the incredible, brave work that the vast majority of men and women in law enforcement are doing every single day, conducting themselves in the performance of a job duty and service to their community that many people just wouldn't want to do these days. So please know, even though we have this horrible thing we're talking about, we know that there are really, really good people doing amazing work every day and fighting on behalf of the victims, sometimes to their detriment, just really, really passionate about their job.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that pops out to me about this binary view we have of authority figures, it's hard because growing up as a child, your view is very black and white, and it should be. You should know when you're safe, when you're not safe, right? But as an adult, you start realizing not every doctor is cut out of the same cloth. Not every cop is cut out of the same cloth, and so on. But in this particular case, another thing that seems significant is the long-term grooming by multiple perpetrators.
Right.
That continues for so long that it affects the victim's behavior. There's this toxic lack of boundaries. There's manipulation, threats, all of which results in horrific trauma bonding. So a lot of people will look at this case and go, well, by this time she was an adult and she can make adult decisions. And immediately I'm like, no, you got to back up and look at the entire history. Some stuff clearly started before she was in the program, but that made it worse. Being in the program made all that previous trauma and let down just a lot worse.
Absolutely. But first, before we take a look at a lot of those layers, let's look at a history of Police Explorer programs across the U.S., and then we can get to some of those points.
So I want to read to you an excerpt that we've taken from the Law Enforcement Exploring Program and Resource Guide for Adult Leaders. And that is a thing that exists because these programs exist all over the country. And some of them clearly, as we go through the research, are very, very successful. And of course, we're pointing out one that has gone horribly, horribly wrong. Law Enforcement Exploring is the preeminent career orientation and experience program for young people contemplating a career in the field of criminal justice. Its mission is to offer young adults aged 14 to 21 interested in a career in law enforcement a personal awareness of the criminal justice system through training, practical experiences, and other activities. Law Enforcement Explorer posts are sponsored by local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies throughout the country. Law Enforcement Exploring is endorsed by numerous professional organizations to include the International Chiefs of Police Association and the National Sheriff's Association. Law Enforcement Exploring is a well-established and highly respected program that has served as a platform from which countless young adults have launched a successful career with local, county, state, and federal law enforcement agencies. So, in 1935, the Boy Scouts introduced this term Explorer Scouts for senior members, and they were organized into explorer crews within the Boy Scout troops. So exploring became a separate program from the Boy Scouts of America in 1959, and this was likely inspired by the Boy Scouts organization's really great successes. So that same year, the Orange County Sheriff's Department in Southern California established the first Law Enforcement Explorer post. And in 1976, a grant from the Law Enforcement Assistant Administration allowed the Boy Scouts of America to enhance and promote law enforcement exploring, leading to national tracking, conferences, leadership academies, and the establishment of national youth leadership positions. And then in 1998, exploring became a part of the Learning for Life program, which is a subsidiary of the Boy Scouts. And this focused on career interest and orientation, while Learning for Life itself is an academic and character education program that's legally independent from the Boy Scouts of America. Now, recent times in recent years, there's been a lot of controversy about Boy Scouts because that's a whole other
Right.
area that we
Yeah.
can't even go down that rabbit hole. But to say also with the awful comes some really great things like the Explorer programs, Boy Scouts. I mean, these kind of leadership programs have absolutely provided a step up for young people from lower income, from lower SES, from marginalized neighborhoods. I mean, it has been a wonderful opportunity. Unfortunately, we're turning over a rock and showing some of the worst things that have happened.
Indeed. Overall, the Explorer program aims to prepare participants for future careers while also helping them develop as individuals and community members. The stated mission of law enforcement exploring is to provide young people interested in law enforcement careers with valuable experiences and skills. The program focuses on 5 key areas: career opportunities, life skills, citizenship, character education, and leadership. Through law enforcement exploring, participants can expect to explore different criminal justice careers and interact positively with law enforcement professionals, get hands-on experience with the criminal justice system to help them decide if a law enforcement career is right for them, receive special training that may also count for academic credit, grow personally through self-discipline, teamwork, and high standards of behavior, as well as improve their character, physical fitness, and mental well-being. They are also there to learn about responsibility and leadership, and of course, give back to their community by supporting their sponsoring agency in different law enforcement roles.
And I can also imagine that young people are even considering like possible avenues like the FBI, criminology, psychology, forensics. This would be an awesome opportunity. And one of those things too, if you're really looking to get into a competitive college, this is the type of thing that starts your youthful resume. I have a lot of mixed feelings about that. I wish sometimes kids could be allowed to be kids, but then again, a program like this that enhances all these other areas of your life is pretty impressive. And it's really important to understand that these programs are not cookie cutter. They're not all the same. There's a governing agency that wants to start an Explorer program, and they will have an incredible latitude how they want the program to look and how they want it to function. So before launching a new law enforcement Explorer post or reviving a dormant one, the agency's chief, sheriff, or leader, they have to first decide what kind of post they envision, how it will fit within their agency. Law enforcement exploring allows sponsoring agency a lot of flexibility in designing the organization, the structure, and the activities of its post, as long as it complies with that other organization we were talking about, Learning for Life. So the flexibility results in a wide variety of structures across the country, ranging from loosely organized groups with minimal programs and open membership. That's a problem right there. I mean, already we're describing it as loosely organized. You're working with kids. So this does need to be highly organized and structured, right? Because some of them absolutely do just that. Probably in more dense urban areas, I would think they're a lot more structured with very strict membership standards, progressive training programs, including hands-on experience, and then really designing the activities to be engaging for the young people at the age of understanding they have, given what their chronological age is, right? Because experience shows that these well-organized posts with very clear standards and comprehensive programs will be more successful than those that are just loosey-goosey, to use a term.
Yeah. And that resource guide for the adult leaders that are going to be starting these posts really does a great job of explaining the structure, the hierarchy, the goals, recruitment strategies for the programs. And in reading through the PDF that you're going to find in our resources, there is a startling lack of explanation, like not even a paragraph on supervising the directors, the standards of care, or the rules of engagement, as it were. So now maybe this is not the document that would explain all of it. Perhaps, that's better suited. Maybe there's an actual online training these days now that they have to go through, but a well-structured, well-planned manual should really have a lot of these things in there. That being said, there's an assumption of sort of post-certification, police officer standards and training certification, which addresses some of this, at least here in California. But it was even hard to kind of tell, who is a governing body of this? Like I wanted
Right.
an association or, something. It was hard to find that online, which made me concerned, I guess.
Right. And there's a distinction here to be drawn. You've done post, right?
Oh, yeah, you have to. I mean, you have to be
Okay,
post certified as a police officer when you graduate the
Right.
academy.
When I was a law enforcement psychologist, that was one of the first things, like you have to go get post certified. And it was an intense week-long training. It was fantastic, really great instructors. What I will say, though, in the context of the episode today is that there wasn't any reference to moral standards.
I'm sorry, what was your training?
It was
Post is the overseeing body that certifies all training in law enforcement.
Well, this was, I guess, for education.
Oh,
so I had to become, in order for me to engage in any kind of educational activities with law enforcement, I had to have this certification.
Got it.
Yes.
Got
okay.
it.
So anyway, I mean, like there was a lot that we learned, and maybe in other areas or other definitions of post certification, because this was only one, this was for becoming a trainer, is there wasn't this focus on, your responsibilities, work. And there wasn't even really, how do you work with difficult students, which would have been really helpful. I mean, one of the things as a therapist you learn is rolling with resistance, because we don't always have willing clients, right?
No.
You have to find a way around that.
Sure.
What was news to me in kind of diving into this area is the breadth of programs beyond Scouts and the Explorer programs. And when you visit the website, exploring.org, you see this astoundingly comprehensive resource guide that is designed for students interested in exploring, pursuing careers in a number of fields. So while they're not available in every city in the U.S., I was blown away by the number of training opportunities. I mean, like if this had existed when I was a kid, and maybe it did, but I had no idea. Law enforcement, healthcare, aviation, communication, arts, engineering, humanities. It's amazing. And it's part of that larger organization, Learning for Life, that we had discussed earlier, with the goal to help young people make informed decisions about their potential future careers by offering this chance to interact with all these professionals and participate in career activities, develop these life skills. So any interested student can find information about different exploring programs and how to join these local posts. So check out that website. It's really interesting. When researching this, my mind was kind of blown. Are these programs promoted more than I'm aware of? Like maybe I'm just not in that mix.
I had no clue that there were exploring programs outside of law enforcement. So this was all news to me too. But how cool, like aviation, and especially when you're talking about this age range, because, you and I probably get emails and questions all the time, like, hey, can I just like volunteer or intern, in psychology, which is so tricky because of confidentiality. Usually you have to be associated with a university already. But some of these are really cool ways to get in there. I mean, and just see what it's like. And I am all for getting early exposure, because almost the more valuable thing is to realize, oh no, this is not for me. Like you're not just getting the fluff and the sort of shiny idea of what this whatever given field is. You're seeing behind the curtain. So that's pretty cool.
No, that's a really good point. I would add to it that even if you're discovering what is not going to be a good mix for you, there are other skills that can be learned in that process. Like adult skills of professional interaction are so important, and that people just don't understand how they open doors to you. Like just knowing how to interact in a professional manner, even as a young person, it takes your marketability to a whole different level.
Yeah, totally. Many police departments also have a police cadet program, which is for a slightly older group of young adults. So you have your explorers, who generally we're talking high school age, and then cadets are more like college age. So the main distinction between police explorers and cadets, aside from age, is that cadets go through generally the same hiring process and scrutiny of other civil service government jobs, and they are employees of the department. They get paid. Most of them are working part-time while they're going to college for their undergrad. So the idea with the cadet program is to really focus more on young men and women who are looking for a job in law enforcement. So the benefit to them is they get the background experience to get hired, potentially even with that same department, or they can look into other options. And the department is getting the benefit of hiring this part-time worker and investing in them. And hopefully they'll want to come work for us and we'll already know them. They'll be vetted, all of that. So we're generally talking college age people, 17 to, early 20s, going to school, doing all this at the same time. This is the route that I took. I think a lot of you guys out there might know my story, that I was looking to get hired at the state of California after college. So I became a police cadet at my local police department just to get some experience under my belt while I was completing my bachelor's. And then when I graduated, there was the state hiring freeze. So I was like, okay, I guess I'll go to federal law enforcement, but I needed some actual full-time experience to do that. And then the department where I was a cadet agreed, yeah, great. We'd love to hire you as a police officer for as long as you'll give us. So it worked out really well for me. It wasn't the avenue I was planning on taking, but it was a cool job. I mean, my duties were really varied, as you can imagine. It was super exciting for a criminal justice and psychology student to be working at the police department. I worked everything from just the front desk to overnight answering phones. I went out into the field and served subpoenas. I would help out with all sorts of training that the officers were doing. And then I eventually ended up working in the detective bureau as their cadet back there. And I was assigned to the property and evidence division. So I would run stuff back and forth to the crime lab, which is always awesome, driving out to LA and dropping stuff off at the sheriff's crime lab, helping document, preserve evidence, learning all of that. But I went on a lot of ride-alongs. As part of your shift or before or after your shift, you could go on ride-alongs just like any other citizen. And it was so nice to go out, see what police work was really like in this relatively quiet mid-sized town in Los Angeles County, and just really get to know the ins and outs of what the police officers were doing and to see what that interaction with the community was like. We're talking hours generally of being on ride-alongs. No one was ever inappropriate with me on a ride-along. I can definitely say that. I think I was also smart enough to think, who's the person I'm going to learn from that I can be alone in a car with for hours at a time and just kind of choose wisely who I was going to be on a ride-along with. But I had nothing but good experiences. So I think the other part of this is that in law enforcement, this really became a big part of my social circle as well. So we're talking get-togethers and parties at people's houses. I met a lot of families, wives, children of the officers that worked at the department. We had that big annual race that ends in Vegas every year, which is where I eventually met my husband. Like, there's a lot to say about, and I don't mean that, I mean this in a very light way, sort of the incestuous, like, social circle of law enforcement, because you tend to sort of just hang out with people who do the same job as you. But that was a little bit problematic for me when I transitioned from police cadet to rookie cop, because here I had been brought into the social fold of everybody. And now I had to be the rookie and like, yes, ma'am, no, sir, and kind of find my place again. And I'm, me, I'm a gregarious social person. So I was like, oh, hey guys, I'm back as a cop. And they're like, no boot, you need to like learn your place. And it was weird, especially in a small department. But I got into line. It worked out fine. But as I mentioned in our shrink wrap, and I will actually say less here, I think, the blurred lines between professional tenured coworkers and young adults working at the department was certainly present. I mean, I can say that for myself. I made, again, as an adult, I made each of my own decisions on how to navigate that to whatever extent with, full consent if I'm agreeing to like go to a party at someone's house or what have you. And if you remember, like I wasn't planning on working there forever. Actually wasn't my plan to become a cop there. So I think I had a little bit of a buffer of like, okay, this is cool for now. And these are my people and I'm going to hang out with them. It just sort of ended up happening that I was like, oh crap, now I have to be a coworker here as a real adult at some point. But I can tell you when I moved on to being a police officer and kind of to that next generation, I saw the same thing. I saw the same mingling with the young ladies. And to be clear, not anyone who was an explorer underage that I ever saw. But now I was kind of like having to call out my peers, like, dude, what are the optics of having this young lady on a ride along in your car night after night? Like, you just have to be hopefully making the right decisions, but also like just thinking about the optics. So yeah, it's interesting. I just wanted to give like an inside out perspective a little bit. And you can probably already think of, listening to this, how this would be like the perfect petri dish for inappropriate behavior. Yet it's in this environment where everyone sort of thinks, well, it's law enforcement. They know better. It's totally going to be fine. And I think that's where we get caught up. That's not always the case.
That's a great and very thorough exploration. I appreciate it, because a lot of our listeners don't really have the full picture of these kind of benchmark experiences that we had that got us to where we are today as professionals. And I think that was, thank you for sharing that. And especially, kind of particularly sharing that it wasn't always professional and the boundaries were blurry. I think that unfortunately that is still pretty endemic to our work culture here in the US and maybe even other places in the world. And it's one of the reasons we still have so much conflict in our community and political discourse, because now as agencies and HR departments are kind of putting a stop to things, going, no, there's a procedure. There's a way you act. You're not allowed to say that. You're not allowed to imply that. No, you can't ask for a hug. I mean, these things that sort of are embedded into our culture. And we have people that are on the side of it, including a lot of younger generations, going, yeah, I don't want to fucking eat your brownies, Janice. Don't get mad at me for not eating your brownies. Don't get mad at me, Bob, for not coming out and having drinks with you and the guys, like that kind of thing. And what's really interesting is that there are people who are so embedded in that culture, who are generally older, my generation and older than me, that kind of want to throw this woke label on it. It's like, no, treating people with human adult decency is something that we should continually evolve towards, right?
Sure.
Yeah. But again, back to the point of our talking about there's programs, these wonderful programs that we're both, reading the foundations of. What a great idea, and clearly has done some good things. However, there is definitive proof of widespread abuse in these programs across the United States. And according to the Marshall Project, which is a nonprofit journalistic group that focuses on issues in criminal justice, since 1974, there have been at least 194 allegations that law enforcement personnel have groomed, sexually abused, or engaged in inappropriate behavior with explorers. The perpetrators were mostly male police officers, and the vast majority of victims were teenage girls as young as 13, as in Sandra's case. So the Marshall Project found that the lack of oversight was a significant factor in this abuse. There was ample opportunity for offenders to be alone with teenage explorers, and there were some instances in which the inappropriate behavior was reported, but the departments minimized or outright dismissed the concerns. And when you look deeper into the profiles of the demographics of those that are accused, they ranked from early career patrolmen to chiefs of police. It was also not uncommon that they were married men with families of their own, despite some departments not taking allegations seriously. They did find cases that led to criminal charges and even some prison stints, but the other requirements varied greatly. So some received probation or weren't required to register as sex offenders as part of the deal that was reached. They even found that some offenders were able to just get a short suspension from work, and we're talking about them keeping their jobs. Or in some of the more recent cases, they get fired and they go one county over and just hook up with another police agency.
Yeah. And I know, I think since 1974, people are probably like, okay, 194 allegations, that's not a lot. And we really have to keep in the back of our minds here, especially with sex offenses, we know how underreported those are, right?
Exactly.
Now imagine the perpetrator is a coworker and the perpetrator is a law enforcement officer.
Oh my gosh.
Who are you going to report that to? And how is that going to be handled, right?
Yeah.
So yes, even one is too many. 194, gives us at least a number to look at here. But out of 111 agencies, the Marshall Project found that at least 14 departments had a history of repeated allegations. The Marshall Project's website quotes a lawyer who has represented several former explorers who have accused officers of abuse. And Anthony DeMarco says, quote, "One of the greatest injuries that explorers I've worked for have talked about is that they dreamed of being in law enforcement. And just because they were abused and because in some ways it became known, it felt like it got ripped from them," end quote. A key aspect to many Explorer programs, like I mentioned, is the ride along, right? So participants accompany officers on patrol for up to several hours. If we're talking a half a shift or a full shift, that can be a long time. And each agency has its own rules for ride-alongs, some now pertaining to explorers as well. Some impose time limits or rotate the officers that the teenagers spend time with as to, kind of nip in the bud relationships forming and or optics, like I was talking about. And since at least the 1990s, the Boy Scouts have enforced a two deep leadership rule, meaning their requirement is that 2 adults are to be present at all of its programs to prevent one-on-one situations between adults and children. And that has been extrapolated to the Learning for Life programs, which is what this falls under. However, the Boy Scouts made an exception to this rule for police ride-alongs because, you're not going to take up another police officer's time to sit there and go on the ride-along too, which totally makes sense. I get that. There has to be other precautions.
Right, for a solo experience, right?
Yeah, exactly. You're not going to pay an officer's salary to also go on a ride-along just so there's 2 of you there.
Right, and a ride-along is a standalone event too. It's not like it's going to be a regular
I see what you're saying.
thing.
Yeah. So that's a really good point. I wasn't even thinking because my department I worked for, we worked 1-man cars. Other agencies have partners, right, that ride around 2-man cars all the time. Generally, in those agencies, what they do is any ride along will go with like a supervisor or a sergeant. So it's just, you don't have somebody sitting in the back seat. I think it's more logistics than anything else. But yes, exactly. So explorers are allowed to ride solo with an officer, although some of the precautions put in place are that they must be at least 18 years old to participate in a ride along after midnight. So that's an interesting little rule that was on the Learning for Life website. So I don't know if that's like, hey, only adults should be up this late, or nothing good happens after midnight. Is that the saying?
Well, it could be. I think that's certainly all humor aside, that's a generalization that's made. But there have been studies that show third shift workers, even if there is a supervisory structure, there is a different type of language that happens. There's a different type of behavior. It's not always criminal. Studies show that it is a lot less inhibited.
Well,
than
and
day
oversight
shifts.
takes a dive.
Right, it does, because oversight's usually phoning in. I'll say this, I'm not going to say it's a general thing, but want to promote someone as a punishment, you put them on third shift, right? So it's not surprising that these types of very toxic and manipulative grooming relationships have a complete parallel with inappropriate teacher-student relationships. So let's go back and review some of the facts about those relationships with multiple layers of significant power imbalance. So it's terribly noted, but statistically validated. Research shows that 10% of students will experience educator sexual misconduct by the time they graduate high school. That is a staggering statistic. The majority of perpetrators in cases of educator sexual misconduct are male at 89.1% and often serve as teachers, which is 63.4%, or coaches and gym teachers, which is 19.7%. And that data is from the Children's Center for Psychiatry, Psychology, and Related Services. And according to another report from 2019, there's been a significant increase in cases of sexual abuse by teachers. This report indicates that 7% of students in grades 8 through 11 have experienced unwanted and inappropriate touching from teachers, which affects approximately 3.5 million students nationwide. And when including all forms of misconduct, such as inappropriate language or sexual images, this number then rises to 4.5 million students. In 2020, a large-scale multi-state survey conducted by the Department of Psychology at John Jay College of Criminal Justice found that educator sexual misconduct in K-12 education remains staggering to read this. And in 2022, a large-scale multi-state survey conducted by the Department of Psychology at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice found that educator sexual misconduct in K-12 education remains widespread. And among 6,632 recent high school graduates that were surveyed, 11.7% reported experiencing at least one form of educator sexual misconduct during their K-12 education. Staggering.
It is. I mean, because there is not a lot of direct research as to Police Explorer programs and what's going on there. I mean, this is the most obvious background that we have to look at here, and it's really troubling. In a piece written by Maureen Downey, published in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, she asked, quote, "What drives a teacher to pursue a relationship with a student? It seems almost a death wish to me, as the teachers often lose their jobs, their families, and their reputations." End quote. Yes. I mean, yes, I have those questions as well.
Yes. Yes, Maureen, we agree.
Maureen, you are spot on. And it's what we always ask ourselves when we hear this, right? What is going on? There are no reliable statistics on this phenomenon and behavior. And although we see a lot more cases in the news or over the past decade, there still isn't a large body of research on teachers who engage in sexual relationships with students, at least to the why. We can generate estimates that are usually drawn from emerging news stories, of which there are now actually several hundred a year. And of course, most of them reveal male teachers who perpetrate upon female students. Please keep in mind, teachers accused of sexual misconduct represent a tiny percentage of the more than 3.5 million K through 12 teachers in America.
That's an important distinction to make, because one educator that is acting inappropriately can have multiple victims.
Oh, like we have always said with all sexual perpetrators, right?
Right.
They generally have more than one victim, but they will also put themselves in places of opportunity where they can have hundreds of victims. And as we've discussed in several previous episodes and presentations to law enforcement and other groups, there is now more awareness that female teachers can also abuse students. In a 2013 British study of a small sample of women in positions of trust, including teachers, who had sexual relations with kids in their care, researchers Andrea J. Darling and Georgios A. Antonopoulos found that women didn't lack social skills, writing, quote, "Most of them were perceived to be very successful in their working relationships with colleagues, and most appeared to have friendship groups of their own," end quote.
However, despite the public-facing affect and generally acceptable interpersonal skills that you're talking about, these female perpetrators were found to have significant histories of problems in their own interpersonal relationships. So there's a big difference there, right? Like what you're front facing when you go to work with the sort of outward concentric circle relationships, not like close relationships, but the people just that you see during your work hours, which can be supportive and wonderful at times, right? These people present well in that forum, but they have significant history of family problems or with intimate relationships, right? And this quote from that study says, "This manifested itself in significant dependency on the adolescents for their own happiness," close quote, and gross, right? Like clearly crossing a boundary right there. They go on to say motivations appear to have been primarily driven by intimacy needs rather than any particular sexual deviancy.
Yes, which is the biggest difference we find with male and female perpetrators is the deviancy usually isn't there. It's something else more emotionally driven. And I think you and I and a lot of other people have hypothesized, kind of this idea of the female teacher sort of being stunted in like that adolescence in their personality themselves. I find that so fascinating, especially if you go back and listen to that episode of The Case that I told you about, when the woman was talking about when she was 12 or 13, having these interactions with then Officer Robert Devine. She used such a colorful way to describe him. She's like, he was like the big like jock on campus whose shit didn't stink. Like he was so full of himself. And that's how he acted towards us who were middle school girls. And so I do think the sexual deviancy is certainly there. But it just took me back to this explanation of kind of being stunted in the good times in life, right? When girls were, kind of falling all over you or whatever, but that piece of like dependency on adolescents for their own happiness feels like it ties in.
To tie into one of our previous episodes and two of our previous presentations about Mary Kay Letourneau is, the deep dive into all the interviews over the years and the presentation on camera it was very clear to me diagnostically, and I want to be very careful about diagnosing someone I've never met, but there is a bordering on psychosis in some of the answers.
Sure.
In how she interpreted their relationship with Villy when he was a child. Like, she's misreading and misinterpreting the data that's coming from this is a child. You have an educator relationship with a child. There is no meeting of souls at all. So that's a great example. Though these two, as a contrast to each other, intimacy needs verging on creating a fake relationship. When you have Divine, who is continuing to try and hold on to his golden moment of probably being the big man on campus.
Right, right. So in this British study we were talking about, they continue and say, quote, the abusers themselves tended to explain their behavior as resulting from a genuine romantic and emotional relationship with the adolescent. Most failed to recognize or accept the impact of the position of trust, and all demonstrated a range of cognitive distortions contributing to the occurrence of the abuse in the first place and its continuation thereafter, end quote.
And then, yeah, that kind of fills out what they're saying. They're being a little more professional than I am because they're saying it's a cognitive distortion. I'm going so far as to say, like, there's some mild psychosis there. And then, of course, Dr. Darling, in a further online essay that was published last year, there was more acknowledgement today that female teachers can also be sexual abusers. And that's just something that we used to deny. And that has to come also emerging from our society, where we send different messages to our male youth versus our female youth. Hot for teacher. It's it's getting your manhood started if something like that happens, which takes all of the responsibility away from the perpetrator, the female perpetrator. So the news coverage will often continue to do this romanticization of the relationships. In fact, one of our major news organizations, one of the big five, has done this in the last few years. Like, what's wrong with that? I would have loved to have that opportunity when I was a kid. Ha, 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 ha. It's really, really sick. So Darling goes on to say, there needs to be less of the soft focus, romantic themed shots set against dreamy music, and more of the harsh reality of the impact of this type of abuse on young people, as well as their friends, their families, and communities. So then studies have gone on to show that courts are less harsh on female violators. And in an example that we go to very much, a 43-year-old teacher in New Jersey was originally sentenced to 5 years probation in 2001 for sex with a 7th grade boy, because the judge reasoned that the 13-year-old benefited from the sexual experience and likely suffered no real damage.
Oh my God.
And the judge said, I don't really see the harm in what was done there. And certainly society doesn't need to be worried. Of course, there was outrage, realistically and thankfully so. And an appeals court tossed out the probation a year later and sentenced the teacher to 3 years in prison. Of course, there's no information on whether the judge kept his seat. I'm sure he did.
Yeah. I mean, it's just completely invalidates the experience of a victim. And we know that male victims, boy victims, have a whole special set of circumstances in which it impacts them. And you know what? At the end of the day, it just completely objectifies women again. Anyway, thank you guys for that journey with us on the sidebar of female sex offenders. But I also want to address, there's no doubt that the rise of electronic communication has significantly contributed to an increase in age inappropriate relationships, particularly through the ease with which individuals can connect across age groups. Social media platforms, messaging apps, and still online forums provide a high level of accessibility that has not previously existed. So that's something we are certainly dealing with. This avenue now allows adults to initiate and maintain relationships with minors in ways that are difficult to monitor and control. According to a study published in the Journal of Adolescence, the anonymity and perceived privacy offered by digital communication channels lower social barriers, making it easier for adults to engage in grooming behaviors and inappropriate conversations with younger individuals, while often disguising or lying about their own age. Parents are now fixated on the ability to communicate constantly with children, but the added complication is that the constant connectivity provided by smartphones and other digital devices aggravates and complicates this issue as it enables around the clock communication, making it challenging for guardians or authorities to detect and intervene in inappropriate interactions. And we are starting to see some of that come out in the Sandra Birchmore case, in which very recently, up to her death, even Robert Devine was using an app under a pseudonym to continue to communicate with her.
So it's not surprising. This phenomenon includes online disinhibition, and that plays a crucial role in this increase in inappropriate relationships that are facilitated by electronic communication. So there was a study in cyber psychology, behavior, and social networking, and they assert that people often feel emboldened to act in ways that they might not in face-to-face interactions due to the perceived distance and anonymity of online communication. So we've talked about this many times before. And, you know, if you've ever gotten into a flame war with a keyboard warrior somewhere, people say absolutely awful things to each other. I have been subject to it myself. Like, I have been someone who has said really terrible things. This was a good bit of time ago. I was in a very heated discussion. I will say it was about women's rights. And this was a woman who was basically advocating for The Handmaid's Tale to take over. I was like not having it.
Great.
I was not appropriate, and it wasn't appropriate to me as an adult or me as a professional. So I'm relatively well educated and emotionally managed and regulated. And I can imagine that those without it would probably have a lot more temptation to engage in these types of behaviors. Disinhibition, not just about flaming, though. It's about how it can lead to the development of these inappropriate relationships between adults and minors, because it encourages behaviors that otherwise would be inhibited by societal norms. And like, if you're not hiding behind your phone's keyboard, you might have an idea of immediate social repercussions. But in a digital environment, you just can create this false sense of security, which will allow you to push boundaries and engage in predatory behavior. Does the electronic communication cause predatory behavior? Not saying there's a correlation there, but it certainly opens the door, and it allows an avenue for someone who is oriented to be a predator.
Yes.
And maybe they are not fully predatory, but they may also be in a state where they just are not utilizing their frontal lobes to understand the consequences of their actions.
For sure. I mean, I think we even see it with just like consenting adults, right? It's just a little bit more brazen, or easier, I should say, to send a text and say something that maybe you wouldn't normally say in person, or that maybe can be interpreted in different ways. So it feels like, oh, I'm just going to push send and see how this feels. There's widespread use of electronic communication, which has blurred those lines between personal and public spaces, making it easier for adults to exploit minors' vulnerabilities. And a study in the Journal of Youth and Adolescence highlights that the normalization of constant online interaction among young people has made them more susceptible to manipulation and exploitation by older individuals. And the availability of private messaging features on social media and gaming platforms enables adults to isolate minors from their support networks, fostering relationships that are hidden from the scrutiny of parents, educators, and peers. And this increased access and ease of communication have unfortunately facilitated a rise in age-inappropriate relationships, underscoring the need for greater awareness and protective measures in the digital age. Previously, when we talked about online sexual offenses, internet sexual offenses, we did a whole 3-part series a few years back. It's grooming, traditional grooming methods that have been done in person before, taken online. You can see like the direct parallels that happen there. As part of my consultation work that I do outside of my day job, I actually many years ago had a police department contact me and said, we would like you, with your expertise, to look over these hundreds of text messages between a police officer and a police explorer. And we want your opinion. What's going on here? Is there grooming involved? Has there been a sexual relationship? And that wasn't obviously explicitly stated in these text messages, but they hired me to kind of give my 2 cents of what was going on there. And I can tell you the way in which this officer's wording and use of emojis and tone change through text messages was grooming 101. Like brought him down to this explorer's age level, maturity level, just through text messages. It was pretty astonishing.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a ton of overlapping risk factors and issues that we've talked about before in several episodes that I think are worth just like brief mentions here. One of those is power bases. When we have talked specifically about sexual crimes, of course, it can happen in other types of assaults, but these are any type of circumstances or factors that make the relationship between the perpetrator and the victim feel unequal, that then widens the gap between them to where a victim can feel like a victim, even if it's not obvious or crime hasn't been committed yet, and there is a complete dominance over that person. So in a whole variety of crimes, particularly in sex crimes, that can be physical. It could be like the size of the perpetrator. If they are bigger, stronger, more able-bodied than the victim, then certainly that can be an issue. If they have a weapon, just the presence of a weapon makes somebody more vulnerable on the other side. The element of surprise is another one, right? If you see someone walking on the other side of the street that seems a little sketchy and you kind of get an idea that they're following you, at least your mind starts working of like, how can I try and keep myself safe? If someone just jumps out from the bushes in front of you, you have very little time to try and, make up a plan to be less of a victim, I guess. But then we've also talked about these other issues of like the power of celebrity and the power of authority. And I think, yes, physically, these can put someone in a state to where they feel more like a victim when a crime is about to be committed or is being committed. But going back to what you were saying earlier about, yeah, we can be talking about people who are technically adults here, but how do these power bases influence consent? Because you can be saying, yes, or I agree to this, but what is that being influenced by? And I think that's really important here. I think another layer just under this sort of power base or authority abuse issue is just things that we talk about when we talk about workplace violence or sexual harassment. What if the perpetrator is now your boss? What if they are, as a part of their job or their occupation, an authority figure? Someone that has a good reputation, that everyone sees as a pillar of a community, that's getting awards, a family man. How does that then influence what a victim is either going to do in terms of reporting or even backing up to consent? How is that going to impact them? And then even more so, if we drill down, how does this play out when you as a victim are a quote unquote student of the tradecraft and now you're the prey, right? Who do you tell? Is your dream career going to be ruined by reporting this? Or let's say you don't ever report it. Maybe the sparkle is just completely taken out of that dream for this young person because they've seen the dark underbelly of it. There's just, endless consequences to this.
Yeah. I remember, this is a broad example, but I only recently discovered a few years ago after reconnecting with a woman that I danced in several shows with. Gifted dancer, wonderful, unbelievable personality, still wonderful personality to this day. But she just kind of disappeared like a good, before the rest of us dropped out of the industry to, do other things, just disappeared. And she came forward a few years ago to say, yeah, I just got tired of the sexual harassment all the time of being a dancer and auditions. And, she's just like, and so this incredibly talented woman left this thriving career. But back to the point, some of the other points about this one we mentioned over and over again, and it's important that we keep coming back to it. And that is the idea of sexual attraction to adolescents. So very clear here, heterosexual male natural attraction to post-pubescent females. Yes, it is natural to be attracted to individuals, male or female, that have secondary sexual characteristics that are developing. That is not in and of itself a deviant experience.
Correct.
But you can't act on it. You
No.
cannot act on it. It is
Bottom line.
inappropriate. It is immature. It is unethical. It is immoral. And it is part of your responsibility of being as an adult is like, this is not something that is appropriate for this individual's development just because the physical mechanics are there for procreation, which is, I mean, what it was designed for, I mean, or what we've evolved for, but you can't act on it. And that seems to fall on deaf ears in a lot of communities, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, it does. And I think it's just a layer that we certainly have to say, yes, this is part of the formula. If we look at this petri dish of, trying to examine what is going on here, there have to be more rules in place because obviously there are a select few that cannot not act on this, right? So, I mean, that's why we're here talking about it.
And we're not minimizing
today.
that phenomenon either, definitely.
Yeah, exactly.
But going on, the other point that wraps around all of this, especially when it comes to authority positions and particularly in police populations, is the concept of behavioral drift. We've talked about behavioral drift in a number of episodes and how it applies to different cases. We just want to reiterate and define behavioral drift as this tendency to deviate from ethical standards under the pressure of circumstances and within the absence of external oversight. So peer pressure and absence of supervision and containment is not a good combination. That's really, really not a good combination. Most people figure it out by the time they're adults, but even adults can be prey to this. You put a number of factors in: low oversight, peer pressure, third shift dynamics, that kind of thing. Those would all contribute to it. But it can be further defined as continual reestablishment of new, often unstated and unofficial standards of behaviors in an unintended direction. So these are the unwritten rules. Like, you go into a new job and you're like, oh, I've got the manual, I've signed up for everything. And then you've got a senior member that comes over and goes, well, let me tell you about how the place really works, right?
Yeah.
That is an example of a seed for behavioral drift. And it occurs when established official standards of behavior are not followed and enforced. So ambiguous guidance, poor supervision, lack of training, lack of oversight, and then certain psychological and social pressures are greatly increased, and they increase the likelihood of behavioral drift. And then it becomes this notion of like, we're all doing it. We're all going into the cocaine stores in the
cocaine stores? Where are those?
In every police drama, there's always like the evidence locker. Like there's always a huge store of drugs, right?
We're all taking
just sitting there. Got to stay up during that third shift.
Yeah. I mean, so many underlying issues here. And behavioral drift is always one when we talk about some bad people of certain professions doing things in the course of their work. There's another thing that I just want to mention. We cannot dive off into this. It's a bigger topic and a bigger problem. But what we're talking about today is one extension of that. And that's just police sexual abuse. And this is when police officers use their power and authority for sexually motivated reasons, behaviors, or misconduct. So specifically, we're talking about things that are very symbolic and have influence, like the uniform and a weapon and a sense of authority that this perpetrator already has, and it is being wielded to conduct these behaviors and this abuse. And it's a very isolating experience for victims, again, because of, is anyone going to believe me? Should I report this, etc. Imagine how low the rates of reporting potentially are for these types of sexual misconduct behaviors. So this would be anything, including, like I said, misconduct, which is generally like something that there's a rule or policy in place within that organization, or abuse against other employees, like we're talking about today, or of course, vulnerable people that they come across in their daily jobs, like trying to pick up or date a domestic violence victim who just had a crime perpetrated against them. And now you're coming in to take the report and you're asking for their phone number. That might be very confusing and off-putting, and you are narrowing in on someone who's vulnerable. Or even some of the horrible circumstances that we've heard of in which sexual favors are being exchanged for getting out of tickets, or just straight up sexual assaults in the course of their duties. There's a wide variety to how law enforcement officers can use their position of authority to enact these behaviors. Again, a bigger topic for a different episode, but just didn't want to be remiss to not talk about what we're discussing today is part of a larger picture. Unfortunately, just because it's a larger picture, it's a larger issue.
Absolutely. So we have a couple of examples of other criminal cases. This one was with the Louisville, Kentucky Police Department. Huge case, probably the most high-profile case up until this one that we started off with. And this was a civil suit that was filed 4 years ago by 7 former youth participants in the Louisville Metro Police Department's Explorer program. And they alleged abuse by officers. And it was finally settled in October of 2021 after a 7-year court battle. The settlement, amounting to $3.65 million, was divided among the plaintiffs, according to Tad Thomas, who was the attorney that represented the victims. The plaintiffs are only identified by their initials to protect their identities because this happened when they were minors. They accused the officers of crimes that included sexual assault, stalking, and harassment. The lawsuits also claimed that the police department attempted to cover up the abuse, further compounding the trauma experienced by the victims. Attorney Thomas highlighted that the emotional toll that litigation took on the plaintiffs, noting that the legal process forced them to repeatedly relive the horrific experiences that they had endured. The Explorer program was part of this existing collaborative structure between law enforcement and the Boy Scouts, and it was another example of a backdrop for severe misconduct by those in positions of authority, just like our first case study.
The scandal first came to light in 2015 when 2 participants of the program accused former Louisville Metro PD officers Kenneth Betts and Brandon Wood of sexual abuse. These allegations sparked a wider investigation that ultimately led to the involvement of a 3rd officer, Brad Schumann, who later pleaded guilty to charges stemming from a separate incident way back in 2010. Betts, Wood, and Schumann, all of whom held positions of trust with the program, were subsequently convicted of sex-related crimes in federal court. The criminal acts committed by these officers were discovered to not be isolated incidents, but part of a broader pattern of abuse that they purposefully chose. The depth of misconduct was further revealed in a disturbing 52-page report released to a local news station by LMPD. The department's professional standards unit investigated allegations of inappropriate behavior by Betts, uncovering a toxic treasure trove of details. In a memorandum dated September 5th, 2013, a text conversation between Betts and a 16-year-old female explorer is documented. In the exchange, the girl informs Betts about which explorer advisor is present at the detail she's working. Betts then suggests, maybe I should come out and see you, and asks if he should wear his uniform or plain clothes before adding, I want to surprise you, and I really want to make out.
So, Officer Paris was later interviewed by LMPD's Professional Standards Unit about that night at a church picnic. Paris stated that he was sitting in his cruiser when the victim asked to join him, and then mentioned the quote-unquote weird texts that they were receiving from Betts. They also told Paris that Betts had sent them photos of, quote unquote, a guy's chest, which they doubted was Betts because, quote unquote, the guy had abs, and I don't think Betts has abs. Okay, I just love that teenage shade.
Me too.
Of course, me giving a teenage voice, but I mean, it does show like, oh, come on, like if you're going to catfish me, do a little bit better job, okay? But there's another disturbing account that comes from a male victim of Betts, and this victim, who met Betts through the Explorer program, described how their relationship began with friendship, but quickly took a dark turn because Betts allegedly started suggesting sexual scenarios involving the teen boy and the teen boy's girlfriend. The situation escalated when the boy received a speeding ticket and expressed concern that it would ruin his chances of becoming a police officer. According to the victim in his interview, Betts offered to wipe the ticket in exchange for a sexual favor, further demonstrating the extent of his exploitation. So what he's trying to do in this scenario, how I'm reading it, is that Betts was trying to get to the boy's girlfriend by using him.
Oh, okay. I thought Betts wanted to see the boy with his own girlfriend, his adult girlfriend. Got it. Kenneth Betts, along with Brandon Wood and Brad Schumann, is now serving time for his involvement in the Explorer program sex abuse scandal. Betts is currently serving a 16-year federal sentence, which will be followed by 20 years of supervised release. The settlement was reached in part because the plaintiffs faced significant legal challenges, including the statute of limitations and the Boy Scouts of America's filing for bankruptcy, which just complicated the pursuit of justice, unfortunately. Attorney Tad Thomas acknowledged these hurdles, explaining that the decision to settle was influenced by the plaintiff's desire to avoid the risk of prolonged, even more prolonged, and potentially fruitless litigation. The fallout from the scandal was thankfully swift. In 2017, Mayor Greg Fisher suspended the Explorer program, acknowledging the severe breaches of trust that had occurred. And in a statement he released following the settlement, Fisher emphasized a commitment to uncovering the truth and securing justice for the victims. He expressed hope that the settlement would bring some measure of closure to those affected and stressed the importance of continuing efforts to prevent such appalling misconduct in the future. That's the important part. What are you going to do about this for the future? Don't try to say that money is going to bring closure to anyone. What are you going to do about it?
Right. So this $3.65 million settlement will be dispersed amongst the 7 plaintiffs, with more than $3 million of the total coming from Old Republic Insurance Company, which is the insurer for, guess what, Boy Scouts of America. The remaining amount will be covered by the Metro's self-insurance under the Louisville Area Governmental Self-Insurance Trust. This settlement marks a significant, though painful, conclusion to this case that just exposed all these flaws in this program, a program that's meant to nurture and guide the next generation of law enforcement professionals. What a way to really screw it up.
This is so interesting. Thank you for including where the settlement money comes from, because I don't think, one, we ever hear about that. But also, what the hell? I know this is a subsidiary of the Boy Scouts, but this is happening with police department employees. Why are they not paying the bulk of it?
Exactly. That's really, I'm wondering how they managed to make that happen, but I couldn't find any more information.
So looking at another case, Indiana online newspaper writers Holly Hayes, Robert King, and Ryan Martin wrote extensively about a major case involving Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department officers Francisco Olmos and Daniel Bullman, who were embroiled in a scandal involving the suicide of an 18-year-old woman. The young woman was found to have been involved in the IMPD Explorer program. Officer Francisco Olmos, 31, was charged with the obstruction of justice and computer trespass after allegedly deleting text messages from the woman's phone following her death. These messages, which were later recovered through advanced forensic technology, contradicted the timeline and details that Olmos had provided to investigators. The woman, who had expressed interest in a law enforcement career, had been in frequent communication with Olmos, exchanging hundreds of messages and even participating in ride-alongs with him. Despite his claims that they were not intimate, the recovered messages painted a picture of a close and complicated relationship.
On the day of the woman's death, phone records show that Olmos and the woman had spoken 3 times, with their final conversation raising concerns for Olmos due to its unusual nature. When he couldn't reach her afterward, he went to her home, where he arrived around the same time as her father and discovered her body. Olmos is reported to have then used the victim's own phone to contact Officer Daniel Bullman, another figure in the case, before allegedly he began deleting incriminating messages between the young woman and himself. The data recovery showed Olmos's desperate attempts to contact the woman leading up to her death, with messages pleading for her not to, quote unquote, do this to him again. Despite being implicated in her death and tampering with her phone, Olmos refused to allow investigators access to his own device.
And Bullman, while not charged in relation to the phone tampering, faced separate charges, including neglect of a dependent and battery. These charges rose from a violent incident involving his ex-wife, who claimed that Bullman had become erratic and delusional following the explorer's death. His ex-wife also alleged that Bullman had been involved with the young woman who had died by suicide. Bullman's attorney, however, denied any connection between Bullman and the woman's death. Both Olmos and Bullman were recommended for termination from IMPD, with Olmos' arrest prompting a review of the cases he had been involved in during his career.
So again,
Tragic
a great
stuff.
example of how the big picture effect across the board, even not having to do with the victim, but anything that this guy has now touched is tainted, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. As it should be scrutinized and these are some of the things that come up for me when you don't interfere on someone's problematic behavior early, and then something like this blows up down the line. Now, not only has that person been able to do the course of their job in what is probably an incredibly inappropriate way, including misconduct and possibly criminal behavior, but now that it's all been found out, you got to go back retrospectively and look at all of the stuff that they did. I mean, it's just an incredible waste of resources and money and energy and whoever was hurt along the way.
There's so much clinically that we could explore about this. I won't go into depth, but just looking at an overview of these types of perpetrators and authority positions, there's so much narcissism. I get to do this. There's nothing wrong with what I'm doing. I'm going to get away with it. There's an element of arrested development, like the big man on campus you talked about, even if it's not in the same mode that female perpetrators present, it is still arrested development at this age of what feels appropriate. I want what I want, and I want it right now. I mean, it would be really interesting to see the same kind of psychological scrutiny on law enforcement male perps that we have on female teachers. So like, let's look at the men's history of troubled relationships. I mean, it's kind of a sexist view to focus on, well, the commonality we found about the female educator perpetrators was that they had a history of personal relationship troubles. Did we look at that in these male perpetrators? I don't know.
Well, and it would be interesting to look at, like, when we talk about grooming and especially victim selection. Clearly, I think, and especially in Sandra's case, she was sized up as somebody who really needed some adult guidance in her life, and was a little bit lost, rightfully so, because of all of the tragedy that had occurred. But it would be interesting to look at the differences there, especially with male perpetrators in this realm, and then kind of looking at the female teachers, or even just male teachers. They are selecting their victims, and if that is sort of honed in on, as we see, unfortunately, in a lot of these environments, because when we're talking about Boy Scouts or, the church scandals or this, it's like, are these kids coming to these programs because they need some after school activities, because families or parents aren't present? That sort of thing, where they're being sized up as easy targets.
Well, I mean, there are recommendations that have come from the John Jay study that we talked about earlier, especially when it has to do with educators. But in conjunction with the Association on the Treatment of Sexual Abusers, they recommend in part some of these bullet points I'm going to go over. And easily these could be applied to law enforcement working with and around adolescents. Examples would include things like enforcing zero tolerance policies for boundary violations of a sexual nature. Cut and dry, done. Like, it's done. Don't brush it under the rug. Don't look the other way. Zero tolerance policy for that. Including educator sexual misconduct abuse as a topic in sexual abuse prevention training for students, for faculty, and for parents and guardians. That's a touchy one because you're talking about something that is a difficult and complex concept with people that can be reactionary, but it still has to be done. And that's going to be for think tanks to figure out how to do that effectively, I think. And then also requiring institutions to have these policies and procedures in place for reporting sexual misconduct by law enforcement, by educators. And it has to be accessible and reviewed by students, faculty, and parents every year. And then, in our country, states have a lot of rights to do things the way they do them. Some states do that really well. Some states don't. But ensuring that all states would pass legislation to prevent teachers from resigning in order to get away from investigations, have to shut that down.
Yeah.
That can't be an option. There has to be an investigation. And then, we're really big in proponents of developing a mandatory national database for confirmed instances of educator sexual misconduct. So, yeah. And then also that's one part of the other is making sure that we provide support and counseling for anyone, student, explorer, who is alleging that a person in a position of authority has engaged in sexual misconduct against them.
Yes, I think those are, they're very simple and to the point and doable for sure. What probably happens is it's like, well, we don't want to scare the parents off. We don't want to plant this in their mind that this could happen. Hey, have your kids join our wonderful program. But, just in case this happens, here's what you need to do.
By the way,
it's delicate.
Yeah.
I get it. I really, in this vein of like, what can we do about this? I really liked what a guest on the podcast called What Happened to Sandy Beale had to say about what law enforcement agencies need to include in their prevention measures. Before I get to those specifics, I highly recommend this podcast. I'm not quite done with it yet. Host and journalist Melissa Jeltsin covers the story of an 18-year-old who was also found dead under suspicious circumstances, and it was ruled a suicide. However, this was in the 70s, and Sandy had been a police explorer and was having a relationship with a married police officer. Very similar. Big thanks to one of our Patreon listeners who was on our shrink wrap that told us that this sounds similar. I just want to say thank you. It is a great podcast. But on this podcast, she has a guest on her show, a former police officer and consultant to law enforcement agencies. And his name is Mark Nguyen, and he discusses the importance of focusing on issues that are bound to come up in any male-dominated field. I thought about things like professional sports and the military totally applies.
Politics still.
Yeah. Things that absolutely need to be talked about in a preventative way. And I love this guy so much. Listen to what he says in the podcast episode. He says, quote, "To be deliberately indifferent to the suffering of women is historic in society, and it certainly reflects it in law enforcement." So that's what you saw. And if anybody wants to debate me on this, I'm more than happy to do it. I mean, I'm not someone who just read this somewhere. I spent my entire adult life working in law enforcement, so I know my family well. Well, all you have to do is look at the history of policing in our country or in another country. It's been a job for men, managed by men, run by men. It's true for the most part of the entire criminal justice system. I think when you exclude women from any function, social or government, and put a bunch of men together in a room, you're going to have problems. End quote. Period. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Not to say that it can't change. I work with officers and detectives that absolutely do not. Like, I have in-depth conversations with them about their frustrations with that type of environment that gets too intense too quickly. But again, that is where people like that are going to gravitate. As adults, whether male, female, or otherwise identified, as adults, we have a responsibility to evolve, to grow, to be more responsible, to have a moral compass, to have an ethical compass in our lives. And yeah, in-group thinking can be very hypnotic, I think.
Well, and we're talking about cultural shifts, and I will let folks listen to it on their own. But, he goes on to suggest this prevention and awareness that really has to be done organization wide. And I really think that's the way to go. I know that Major League sports and associations, they do something similar. I mean, especially with topics of like domestic violence and sexual violence. I just think, what the hell are we waiting for? This needs to be done now. Like, if the MLB is putting all their players through domestic violence awareness and training, we should be doing it as well, because we're just talking about numbers, right? If we're talking about male dominated and these types of crimes tend to have these perpetrators as majority male, let's just do it. Why not? But I just want to circle back, recommend the podcast, The Case from Barstool Sports, who was talking about Sandra Birchmore's case before anyone even knew who Karen Reed was. I mean, really, their podcast is from 2022, season 2, thoroughly reviews the information that was available back then about Sandra and these 3 monsters who were sexually abusing her from Stoughton PD. Big thanks to them for their work on the show and for being a great resource for us today with some of our timeline stuff. A couple things to check out, and I will put those in our show notes.
Yeah, interesting discourse that also kind of bleeds over into politics. I'm not even going to mention this guy's name, but there's a jackass football player who's a multimillionaire who decided while giving a commencement speech that he would express that he was hoping that the women who were graduating, congratulations on your academic success. I hope you will now basically go chain yourself to a stove and start having babies. The idea that there still is this kind of discourse in our society just is really concerning to me as a professional and personally as well. So thank you, folks. This is a long episode, very intense, very in-depth. Feel free to break it up as much as you need to.
Indeed. Yes. So in 2 weeks, we'll be at CrimeCon UK. Again, please come see us if you're going to be there. Because of that, our next episode will be a re-release of a Behind the Couch live stream conversation that we had a couple months back with Dr. Joni Johnston, and that's on psychological autopsies. Fascinating topic, fascinating conversation. And then we'll be back in October with a brand new topic and a brand new episode for you.
So thank you so much, folks. We're going to be so busy over the next month and a half, but we will be back with another episode. We will be jumping online from London with our live stream about the events going on there, which is going to be great. It's one of the best conferences we've really ever been to, and we're very excited to go back. So keep checking in. Consider joining our Patreon for extra swag and extra content. And we will see you next time on LA
Not So
Confidential. Bye, folks.
Bye, guys. We sincerely thank you for spending some time with us today. LA Not So Confidential is part of the Crawlspace Media Network. Each episode is hosted, produced, and written by Dr. Scott and Dr. Shiloh. Our post-production editing and sweetening magic is handled by the multi-talented Jason Usry of Ear Cult Productions.
Our theme music, entitled Cool Vibes Film Noir, is composed and performed by the talented Kevin MacLeod. He graciously allows us to use his music via a Creative Commons Attribution license. Please check out all of Kevin's amazing work on YouTube.
All of the resources for each episode can be found on our website at la-not-so-confidential.com. You can find us on Instagram at LA Not So Podcast, on X at LA Not So Pod, and on Facebook at LA Not So Confidential. Media inquiries and bookings are scheduled at alienistentertainment@gmail.com.
Once a month, we go live on YouTube on Saturday afternoon. So pay attention to our social media announcements to join our interactive broadcast entitled Behind the Couch, where we interview guests on a number of psych, criminal justice, and true crime topics.
And lastly, we'd be honored if you joined our Patreon at patreon.com/LA Not So Podcast. With a subscription, you get an ad-free listening experience, additional content, host interaction, and you'll be the first to know about upcoming live events, social gatherings, and super cool swag.
Thanks for listening, and join us next time on LA
Not So
Confidential.